was able to drastically improve my portrait drawings over the course of last year, and today I'll share what helped me and what habits I now try to avoid. But first, a short disclaimer: I'm not telling anyone to do or not do something. I'm simply showing methods which helped me, and ideally this inspires you for your own drawings. There is no one rule fits all, and you should take everything you see with a grain of salt. That being said, I hope you can take away something useful for yourself today, and now let's start. To demonstrate what I'm talking about, I will draw this portrait here, but first I want to talk about what helped me improve, and that is, I ditched the Loomis Method. Now, if you don't know what the Loomis Method is, it is basically a very structural approach, setting up a whole bunch of rules and guidelines to give you this all-around recipe for drawing portraits. It gained massive, and I mean massive, popularity this time and age, thanks to social media, because people love being sold the idea of this easy-to-follow step-by-step guide. Now, frankly, learning from Loomis was quite beneficial. There are some useful tricks to take away, but I feel like there's a big misconception when it comes to the Loomis Method. The first thing is, it seems beginner-friendly, but it's not. You actually have to have an already basic understanding and knowledge of how facial features look from different angles. Loomis won't help you there at all. The theory of drawing a head from every angle makes sense, and learning to do that with a basic shape is doable, but do you know how to draw a nose from every angle? And this brings me to another point, which is the Loomis Method versus references. For some reason, the most common approach to Loomis is applying it onto reference photos to deconstruct portraits. But here's the thing. It was never meant to be used with reference photos. It only really shines when used with drawing from imagination. And the reason is simple. When you draw different portrait photos, you'll soon notice that the simple basic rule is just not applicable to every face. People just don't have the generic Loomis face, and this is exactly where it will mislead you looking for those perfect measurements. So if you work with and from references, which I highly recommend, be careful about a set rulebook and be prepared to alter those templates when needed. Now, if the Loomis Method works for you, that's great, and don't let me stop you, but if you're looking to evolve your observational drawing, let me show you what I do instead. I talked about this method in another video, and I did not exaggerate with a thumbnail because it did change everything for me. The envelope method. Looking at all the comments I got, it seems like most of you agree with me that it's pretty underrated and not really talked about that much, while others say I'm stupid because they knew about it all the time. But here's where I stand. I am self-taught. I never went to art school. I never had an art mentor or any kind of art training. So I'm probably just like most of you. I'm trying to figure it out all by myself. And I never heard about this technique. I did see some high-end professionals using this method, but they never really explained what it is and how it works. And while I stumbled across it for figure drawing, I now use it for portraits too. And this is how I approach it. So starting this portrait, I don't use a structural approach like the Loomis Method, because it would require you to draw something you don't see. Instead, we're just working with what we see and simplify it. The idea for the stage is to only use straight lines and as few as possible to build up an outer shell, or in other words, the envelope. The only thing you're worrying about right now is drawing straight lines, nailing the right tilt and length of these lines. I'm tempted to say this method is more for advanced artists, but the more I think about it, the more I'm convinced beginners can really benefit from this technique as well. What it does is it sharpens your eyes to pay more attention to tilts and to observe selectively. What I mean by this is it makes you tunnel vision on certain aspects. Instead of details like the shape of the eye, you care more about grouping and summarizing shapes. You have to ignore little indents and see the bigger picture, the bigger shape. For example, his cheek and chin can be summarized with one straight line, as well as the back of his head, because the overall tilt is the same. Try to think of it as a block of marble in which you're carving out shapes. You don't dwell on little details because you need to get the overall composition first. What makes it easier, in my opinion, is to let the lines overlap. This really defeats perfectionism too, because you don't have to worry about drawing a perfect shape at all. Let the lines overlap. I use very light pressure on my pencil and almost hover over the paper. The good thing is this stage is very easy to correct and erase, but if you get it right, this is such a solid base to work with. My tip for this envelope method, if you feel lost on how to connect these lines, is to look for relationships and connections. In this case, I pay closer attention to the back of his head and his shoulder. I imagine a straight line connecting both, which really simplifies the big shape. When it comes to nailing all the tilts, Anthony Ryder, from which I learned about this method, recommends to imagine or even draw a compass rose next to your drawing. This way you can use your pencil to imitate the lines and into which direction they're pointing to. I work from the outer shape to the inside, and I just want to say I know this technique can look intimidating and complex to beginners, but if I'm being completely honest here, every time I used this method, my drawings turned out great. Every time it helped me nailing the right proportions, whereas when I used the Loomis method, there were countless drawings which just didn't seem right because I had to draw things that weren't there, which leads to lots of room for mistakes. I can really recommend Ryder's book, in which he also recommends practicing quick envelopes to get better. When I came across this technique, I thought this is for the best of the best, artists who already have it figured out, and that's why they can use such a method. But the truth is, I am just like you. I am not some kind of prodigy or mega talented. I taught myself, and I strongly believe if I can learn this method, anyone else can too. And just a word for beginners, my biggest tip for you is if you want to become as good as this, learn from it and study it. Don't be intimidated and think this is too advanced, and don't limit yourself to inferior teachings because they seem easier and give a better step-by-step guide. Don't look for shortcuts, take the risk and try something like the envelope method. The biggest mistake I did is to hold myself back because I thought I am not worthy enough to learn certain methods used by professionals. And another big advantage this method has over other structural approaches is that it gives you more control over where you place your subjects on the paper. You could even, before starting out, mark the highest and lowest point in which you want to place your portrait. This technique just gives you maximum control over the whole composition, and as you get better, you notice composition is a huge factor in art. Back to my drawing, I have the general envelope, and now I will work my way inwards and refine some of the lines. I am again carving out shapes, and here I am paying closer attention to negative space. For example, the ones close to his neck. Once I am happy with this envelope, I move to the inside and again look for big shapes. The biggest shapes I see is the hair and ear. I try to identify the approximate distance of hairline to the top of the hair and do the same with the side. And if I wasn't accurate enough, no problem, I can correct at any time. When looking at the ear, this will give you a perfect example of how to see straight lines in a very round feature. The ear will always tempt you to draw some sort of oval shape, but I'm telling you, your ears will look much better and more realistic if you separate it into a few straight lines at first. Same goes for the inside of the ear. Keep it simple. A good starting point on the face for me personally is always the eyebrow line. I summarize both main parts of the eyebrows into one line. This ensures I'm capturing the tilt of his face more accurate. And it also determines the tilt of the eyes, nose, and mouth. Again, don't try to dive into the shape of the eyebrows, just focus on the overall tilt. Now, a trick I always use is to draw a straight line from eyebrow to ear. This way I can manage myself and see if the proportions are decent or not. The ear is usually placed between eyebrows and nose. This is something Loomis mentions as well. But you always have to keep the tilt of the head in mind. Never underestimate underestimate that. In this case, his face is pointing slightly upwards. Plus remember, the ears are placed on the side of the head, which is more flat than the front. It always helps to draw this imaginary line between eyebrows and ears, and I also feel like especially beginners draw ears too small, but they're actually quite big. What I like to do now that I have rough eyebrows, especially from this 3/4 view, is to define the nose shape and size. I try to use only 3 to 4 straight lines to do this. This way I can clearly see if the size is right or not. When it comes to the mouth and eyes, my tip is to mark distances first to give these features a frame. Now here comes another thing which elevated my portrait drawings massively: treating shadow shapes as features. Depending on your reference photo, you will have strong shadow to work with. I highly recommend looking for high-quality reference photos with those nice dark shadow areas. A beginner mistake would be to ignore all shadow, draw the features, and then add the shadows in the end with the shading. I would encourage you to take them more serious. I always let them help me with the proportions. Best case, they throw some harsh edges which you can use to your advantage. As you see in this photo, his left side is clearly separated by shadow. I use this line to let it guide me to the mouth. Another thing with shadow shapes is that in some cases the shadow areas have a higher priority than the shapes of the features itself. What I mean with this is, take this left eye. A beginner would probably jump into drawing this eye however he or she thinks it looks. You let your brain take over and convince yourself that this is what this eye should look like. But when you have a dominant shadow like this, take a step back and look for the truth. In reality, the only shapes and lines visible are these. And this is what will make your portrait look realistic. It's these individual shadow shapes which give your drawing likeliness and character, not drawing what you think, but what you see. And to me, this is also what differentiates realism from hyperrealism. Where hyperrealism will capture every single nook and cranny, other fine artists summarize shapes and leave out information on purpose. To resemble this face, you don't need to draw the tiniest variations in this eye. All that matters is the basic information. To me, tilts play a huge role in achieving likeliness and character, so I always keep looking for these tilts and lines within a portrait. Good example is this fold above his right eye. This fold creates a sort of triangle shadow shape, where beginners would probably just draw this wrinkle as a line. More advanced artists are aware of this full shadow shape. Whenever I construct my portraits, I always include shadow shapes into the proportions. So this is basically my process for portrait drawings. As long as I keep everything I just talked about in mind, I am usually able to draw a nice coherent portrait. And once you have a solid base, you can then easily define shapes, round them up, and give them more character. But you cannot draw clearly defined shapes first and then think about proportions and distances later. As for the shading, I start out by filling in the darkest values, and I always respect the absolute darkest value. These are the parts which have to be the darkest in every outcome. A classical beginner mistake is to get carried away in the shading process and accidentally create dark values everywhere. I made a separate video about values and why they are key to a successful portrait. Talking physical techniques, I try to remind myself not to scrub over the page too impatiently and hard. This will only create big gaps on the surface and look very rough. The hair is another thing I can give a tip for. Treating hair as shapes is more useful than drawing individual hair strands. I like to add some hair strands later, but at this stage it's only hindering me in my process. And now with the first areas filled in, you can already see how much work the construction stage did. Having this initial proportional sketch is by far the most important step for me. After I filled in the darkest values, I like to tone the whole portrait a bit by using my makeup brush. I prefer not having the paper color as the middle tone line, but I'm careful to not accidentally get rid of the lines I put down. I filled in the darkest values with my H pencil, the same one I use for sketching, and I try not to completely get rid of the sketch lines underneath. I then gradually build up other areas with shadow, but I make sure to keep the darkest areas dark. For this drawing, I worked with H in the beginning, then HB and 2B. And by the way, I have all my materials linked in the description below. It's not always the exact same pencil grades I use. It depends on my mood and God knows what else. You can always go back and forth and do little corrections. The whole process is fluid and not set in stone, and I like to switch my pencil grades all the time. As for blending, I like to use makeup brushes and paper stumps with light pressure. It really smooths out the paper texture. Another tip I always keep in mind approaching the finish line is to reflect on whether or not I have enough soft and harsh edges. In other words, enough contrast. Contrast makes a drawing real. The contrast of light and dark, hard and soft edges, small and big shapes. These are my most important tips for improving drawings. As you saw, the absolute, by far most important aspect, in my opinion, is the constructing stage, in which you establish the proportions. It doesn't make a finished drawing, but if you build a solid base, the rest will come together way easier. And whether drawing is your main thing or painting, I think all portrait artists can benefit from learning about portrait drawing techniques. I hope you found this insight helpful. Please let me know if you tried any of these and if it works for you, or if it doesn't and why. And I'll see you next time.